I am going to introduce the moderator of the panel to you this morning, Ken Abdo, and then Ken will do the intros for all of our panelists. Ken Abdo is an entertainment attorney in town here. He is one of our best entertainment attorneys. He's with Loman Abdo. He's a great friend of the festival, and he has sat on many panels himself and has moderated many panels.
Thank you, Susan. Welcome, everyone. This is Sunday at the Movies, and we have a wonderful panel here. As a prefatory remark, I want to just share with you that my grandfather immigrated with my grandmother, who I think he basically stole from Lebanon, and immigrated to the United States in 1909, settled Northeast, and not far from where we are right now. And through my childhood, we were raised Roman Catholic, which is even more different than the Maronite rite, which is a popular Christian rite in Lebanon. To move over to Lebanon to here, even as a second, my dad was born in 1912, I was born, and you don't even know that, but I was, other than I was born, and we grew up in this environment where people didn't know what Lebanese was here in Minneapolis. I've been a lifelong resident here, went to De La Salle for a year, went to Washington High School, University of Minnesota, and people didn't even know what Lebanese was. They were like Arab, or I worked for a guy in high school, and a father of a guy I went to high school with. He used to call me Arab. That was my nickname, Arab. Arab, get this. Arab, do that. You know. And I said, whatever. At least I got a job. But it was interesting that when I was asked to moderate this, I was like, this is one of those who would have thunk it moments to me. That we'd be having this festival here in Northeast with, people that are very knowledgeable about the Mideast. So my background, my grandfather was very much a melting pot generation guy, so it was learn English as soon as you can, don't marry a Lebanese woman, it was Americanization, and we were raised in that. So it's constantly, I don't speak Arabic, but I can curse pretty good because I got that at me a lot. So I remember those words, but that's about it. All right, well, let's talk about these folks sitting next to me. This is Daniel Tutt. Daniel is the Outreach Director of Unity Productions Foundation. It's an educational foundation dedicated to working for peace through the media. He implements educational and social media campaigns that combine film and dialogue aimed at increasing understanding between Muslims and people of other faiths and backgrounds. Unity Production produced the Islamic art, the film is Islamic Art, which immediately follows this panel. He also produced 8 different films about the Muslim experience. So thank you for being here, Daniel. Next to Daniel is Imad. Imad Labidi is an international media and film scholar. Imad lectures at the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of many publications on the clash of civilizations, film theory, and identity formation. His research centers on the analysis of neo-imperialist Western thought in the cultural expression, politics, and media representation of race. That reminds me of like a college question right there. Would you please explain the Alabama? Thank you for being here very much. I really doubt your class was offered when I was at the University of Minnesota. I'm sure it wasn't, Okay, so here we have Rabbi Amy Eilberg. I would like to have dinner with you sometime, because what I'm reading here for the first time is amazing. Okay, Rabbi is the first woman ordained as a conservative rabbi in the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Locally, she directs interfaith dialogue programs in the Twin Cities, including the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning and the St. Paul Interfaith Network. Nationally, she serves as a peace educator and trainer. That's cool. Peace educator and trainer. It's like, not like a physical trainer, but a peace trainer, which is wonderful, in connection with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no less, as well as with issues of conflict within the Jewish community. She now works with the Jewish Council on Public Affairs and its Civility Campaign. She's a leader in several progressive national Jewish organizations, including Rabbis for Human Rights, J Street, and the New Israel Fund. She was awarded the New Israel Fund's Guardian of Democracy Award, and she is working on a book on Judaism and peacemaking with the working title From Enemy to Friend in 60 seconds. Right? So, now I added that. All right. Here's a neighbor of mine, Congressman Keith Ellison. Congressman Ellison is the nation's first Muslim to be elected to Congress. He was widely criticized by conservatives as un-American when he was sworn into office with his hands on the Quran. Keith has emerged in his dealings in the Middle East as an unblinking champion of the best of American historic ideals: democracy, self-determination, and freedom. Thank you for being here very much. Mazen, I think you're the last one, right? I can hardly see you down there. He served on the board of it's MISNA, an Arab American art organization, publishing the only Arab American literary journal and producing Minneapolis Arab Film Festival. Daniel, just because you happen to be next to me, okay, I'm gonna lead off with a kind of a general question about film and in the media. So, what is the impact of film narratives on reality with respect to people, politics, and religion? It's a big question. Take any corner of it. The impact of film on film narratives on reality with respect to people, politics, and religion. Take that where you'd like to go. Get us going.
Well, it's an honor to be here. Be back. So, I mean, when I look at the wonderful lineup of films that are offered here, one of the things that really stood out for me at this festival, under the spotlight of the Middle East, is the idea that if you look at the themes of much of the Arab and Middle Eastern filmmakers, you'll notice that the themes actually touch on politics, but I would say across the board, the themes really have to do with humanity. They have to do with life. They have to do with shrugging off the political pressures, the political tensions that we find both from imposed upon Arab filmmakers from the West and imposed from within their own societies. So if you take the example of the documentary film, one of the things we find is that because many of these countries suffer from such intense censorship and such intense surveillance from the state, from the government, and there is a degree of repression in these societies right now, the documentary takes on a politicized form by its very nature. So the very idea of capturing reality in the Middle East becomes a political statement. So it's very interesting that something that is objective will always inherently have the image itself as an objective phenomenon, will always have a politicized element to it. So, for example, there's one film, Neither Allah Nor Master, from Tunisia, which is a film that is about a very simple objective. It's a woman going around during Ramadan into cafes where people are choosing not to fast during the month of Ramadan. And all she's finding is that people do not want to be filmed. It's almost a mind-numbing objective, but it becomes quite interesting, a capturing of a reality. Another thing we try to find is the shrugging off of politics. In the case of Lebanon, there's a wonderful film about Christian-Muslim relations where we find to get into the subjective reality on the ground, which, you know, in recognition that when you communicate in a film, you are communicating to a global audience. You're not communicating just to a Lebanese, to a Western, but a global audience. So the filmmaker is trying to actually capture a feeling, right? And often that feeling can be mind-numbingly slow, can be very boring, to evoke the commonness of what it's like to actually live in these societies. And that in and of itself demystifies this irrational sense that Westerners have that somehow places in the Middle East are always prone to violence. A wonderful Palestinian filmmaker, Elias Suleiman, if you watch many of his films in the occupied territories, you're not seeing suffering, deprivation, etc., etc. You're seeing funny, irreverent, ironic, offbeat, humanity-based stories. So in that sense, these films, if you were to look 10 years ago, are very qualitatively different. Because 10 years ago, we had major Western institutions, and we still do to a certain extent, dumping resources into helping really what was at the time artisanal filmmakers that lacked a kind of Hollywood infrastructure of gaining resources to make films. But that money, those resources for those filmmakers came with a catch, and that is you need to make films that talk about certain issues, the veil, terrorism, etc., etc. So many of the films in the lineup at this wonderful festival are shrugging off those topics. We're not really interested in that. There's some of it, but there's also a desire to find something that's inherently unique to that culture. So that's just a bit of a
That's a big bit. All right, so let me ask you this. For the uninitiated who haven't maybe don't know nearly as much as you do about the films we're going to see or they can see. Can you give us like a point of view or perspective? Like, I recommend you look at these films with this in mind, or
Yeah.
give us a clue, because some of us, have not immersed ourselves in
Yeah.
in the point of view that some of the Middle Eastern filmmakers have.
I mean, each film is absolutely unique and singular in what it's seeking to do. One of the things that's fascinating is that the poor countries tend to be the ones that have the most edginess. So pay attention to those countries, the ones that are on the margins, the ones that are suffering from some of the most intense political persecution and repression. Those artists are taking the most bold stances.
Thank you. Okay, Imad, this is a tough one. Or you want to follow up?
I just
All right.
want to make a couple of comments on this film critic that comes from Tunisia. Thank you all for being here first. The documentary usually sells itself as a production that is very objective, a production that has no interest other than producing reality, other than capturing reality. But it's very challenging because everything that becomes the subject of camera is no longer neutral. And so when we look at people, in this case, the Tunisian film, where people really refuse to be captured on camera, it's because they, in my opinion, felt they were in a position that put them in some kind of violation. For the filmmaker to try and capture that moment, specifically in Ramadan, within that context, we're really looking at, to an extent, producing a narrative of extreme, producing a narrative of shock. And in that context, when we look at the documentary as a narrative of shock, usually they're very troubling. They come with a lot of questions as to why are we producing a film of that nature during that specific historic moment in Tunisia, when we're really looking at a place that is almost chaotic. This is, very shortly after the revolution, where you don't really know who's with you, who's against you, where suspicion is very high. And so the film could be very misunderstood, obviously, by the average viewer. And clearly, Daniel is way more developed in terms of his ability to read narratives like that. The film, in my opinion, could be misunderstood in the sense that what it did with those rejections is really convey what seemed to be a very embedded narrative, very powerful in the West in general, namely that we're looking at a place where the culture of democracy and the disposition for it. So we're really looking at negating not only the possibilities, the cultural possibilities of creating a democracy, but also a cultural disposition that seems to be there that rejects democracy, period. These people don't know how to be free, they don't really know how to create a system like that, and this is a proof. In my opinion, it could be that way as well.
All right, so now I'm going to skip over you, because you pretty much handled it. So you get an A, and then we're going to go to Keith. Keith, this is a big one. This is kind of, the epicenter of a lot of the conversations that we're engaging now in many communities. So how do film and the media affect the construction of stereotypes?
Well, I think that it could be said, Ken, that, film and the media are always, highlighting one form and therefore creating some form of stereotype. Because, if you point a camera at somebody, you're not pointing a camera at other people. You're highlighting something. The decision to what to film, where to film, when to film, how to film means that you're going to highlight some aspect of humanity and therefore even, unintentionally de-emphasize some other aspect of humanity. So there's always a danger when you do anything that you're going to create stereotype. Now, of course, we're living in an era where, it's not where the filmmaker sometimes isn't even trying to be objective. They have a point to make. And here in the American scene, we've seen movies like Obsession. We've seen movies like, Obsession, by the way, was paid by the Clarion Foundation, paid for about 28 million copies of this, propaganda film to be spread in major newspapers right before the election. And then there's Fitna, another one. Then there's a third, Jihad, another one. All these films are 100% about creating a stereotype, and they remind me of an old film. Really, I think you guys who are film experts can appreciate the importance of Birth of a Nation. Which was historic at the time. I guess it was somewhat of a cinematic leap forward. It was, the angles and the cameras and everything. It was like new stuff. But it created in the mind of the American viewer the idea that newly freed, slaves were ruining America, and that the Southerners who were defeated in the Civil War were coming to save and recapture America. And they pulled it off. That's the movie they made, and they got they stirred the American consciousness in that direction. So when a film like Fitna or Obsession or Third Jihad are played in the Capitol, which they were, it's deeply disturbing to me because I'm aware of the ugly that film can bring, and but I'm also aware of how film can uplift and inspire. When I was a kid, the series Roots was on. I must have been in like the 5th or 6th grade, and neither white or black kids had ever seen black people shown in like anything approaching fuller humanity on film before. And we look back at it now and we're like, oh boy, this is so corny, this is so stupid. But when we looked at it then, it was like, wow, they're showing black people crying over the loss of a family member. And for so many people, I don't think that they really thought we cried over the loss of our family member. They're like, well, they're blacks, they're just cardboard cutouts, And so to demonstrate somebody's humanity on film, I think is a great thing to do. It certainly can be done. And I'm going to wrap it up here, Ken. I think that the Arab Spring is one of the world's most significant developments in the last 50 or next 50 years. It is astounding in its reach, and it's nowhere close to being over yet. And I think that if the filmmaker and the artists are not integrally involved in shaping how we perceive this, then we'll be much poorer for it.
I'm not going to let you go on that because, you have a different perch on some of these international issues than most all of us do. So tell us, what is the Arab Spring? I mean, we're seeing all kinds of news junk, but really at the core, what is it about? What's moving it? Where is it going? Is there a general theme you can put on it?
The Arab Spring is the idea that the Arab people are as desirous of wanting to shape their society as any other human being, are as interested in expressing themselves as any other human being. The idea that are as much as concerned about their own country as they are some other country. I mean, as any other group of human beings on the planet. In my view, that what the Arab Spring represents is a rejection of Orientalist racism, and it's a because I think the world was under the impression, that whenever you talk about they, you got problems, but they need a strong leader like Hosni Mubarak. They are only obsessed with Israel-Palestine, even though they're sitting up in Egypt having food riots because bread is too high. They are like that. They are ultra-religious, primitive. You said stereotypes before. Yeah. And the Arab Spring says all that is lies, right? And it's casting it off. Now, the Arab Spring is going to be messy, it's going to be bumpy, it's going to be setbacks, it's going to be advanced, it's going to be complicated, it's going to be very human. But there's no doubt that there is a irreversible move in the direction of people asserting all the complexity that comes along with being a human being. And it's unique in every single country. But why? Because human beings are unique.
Very good. All right, thank you. Mazen, I want to talk to you about, or ask you about art. Let's talk about, art in kind of a general way. And I know you produced a film festival. I know you're a Syrian-American community activist. And so I'm going to hopefully get an answer out of you that'll hit both of these, and it's in your wheelhouse. And that's about artists. We represent, in my practice, a lot of artists. And some are motivated by the need to get a message out. Some are motivated by the need to just get themselves out. Some are motivated by, I don't even know what, Very few are motivated by money, at least in my experience. And but let's talk about the role of artists in shaping politics and life. Okay, artist power. Okay, maybe relate to personal experience or general experience, but that's what we're here about today. We're talking about art impacting thought, and I'd like you to, if you can, take maybe the artist's perspective on that.
Well, I mean, artists are usually the conscience of a community or a nation. They are the canaries in the mine, more or less. They're the one that step outside of the norm and say, this is right or this is not right, or this is the beauty of the future, or here's a reflection on our community. When it comes into Middle East artists, they really operate, as Daniel said, an interesting medium with a lot of the oversight and in these countries, in a lot of ways, forbidding the work from even making it to the street or having the freedom of expression. You're going to get a lot of artistic expression that's completely entangled with symbolism. And so you may be talking about, as Ahmad said earlier, about an artist walking into the street and filming what's going on in Ramadan. The reality behind it is there's a deep political message that's coming across. And so artists and how they shape the politics there's a connection between them that you're really hard to break in a lot of ways. Stereotypes is another thing that artists are, in some ways, can contribute to it, or they can really break it. The first movie that was made in South Africa about racism was 150 years after South Africa started the policies of racism. So that tells you how much artists sometimes are driven back by elements of money or cultural pressure, but at the same time, it's this boiling water that's just waiting to explode in a lot of ways. When you walk in Egypt to take a look at the expressions that artists have on the streets in Tahrir Square or some of the other areas, it's the same expressions that the average guys have been waiting for years to put out there, but there's either the inability to express it or the fear of expressing it. You can't separate politics from what the work that artists do. You can't separate the shaping of a community from what artists do.
And I'm saving one for you, Rabbi, that'll hopefully bring it all together here in the middle portion. But I'm going to throw out, because the collective knowledge here might be helpful. In Mideastern filmmaking, are there stars that we should be looking for, or that we should be looking at? In the lineup of the films, you have an amazing lineup of films. Is there some person, either actor, I'm thinking more interested in like an actor, that is being seen as powerful because of their position and their statements in film? In rock and roll, we have emissaries like Bono, right? Bono can see the Pope whenever he wants, and that sort of thing. Is there anybody like that we should be keeping our eye on? Maybe who's a younger person, or might be at the fore of this powerful artist in film in the Mideast?
Well, I'm so glad you asked me that question, even though our pre-panel communication was thwarted in some ways. Yeah, the star, in my view. I have no particular expertise in the Arab Spring, but I do in Israeli-Palestinian conflict issues, and there is really a shining star of a filmmaker, of a film production company that I hope is already familiar to some of you. The company is called Just Vision. It's a joint Jewish, Palestinian, American, and Brazilian film company. The filmmakers have backgrounds in human rights and international aid and conflict resolution work. They're educators, they're dialogue people, and they make films for the purpose of using film as a jumping off point for dialogue and education. So some years ago I meant to look up the dates of production. The Just Vision folks produced a film called Encounter Point, which is a documentary, really close and very powerful documentary about an extraordinary organization called Parents Circle Families Forum, which is a group of 500 families, half of them Israeli Jewish and half of them Palestinian, all of whom have lost either children or other primary relatives to the violence. And they have an organization which brings them together for dialogue, for building understanding, and for working for peace together. So in Counterpoint, playing on the checkpoint phenomenon, pictures the activists of the bereaved parents who've lost a brother or child going to visit newly bereaved family members, some of them at their most enraged moment of their lives, understandably, humanly, to try to persuade them that the people who understand them the best are those on the other side who have experienced the same kind of loss. They have their Just Vision second film, full-length film. It's a film called Boudreaux. All of these have been shown all over the world and won all sorts of international film awards, including in the Jewish world and in the Arab world. The Boudreaux film is a study of a particular Palestinian village, one of many, but the kind of most best known and perhaps best organized of the Palestinian villages in the West Bank, trying to protest the root of the separation wall built by Israel. The root of the barrier or wall, in many cases being what many people consider a land grab, and in this case, separating the residents of the village separating their homes from their fields and their livelihood. And it's an extraordinary film, and it includes Israeli peace activists standing with the residents of the village against Israeli military. And recently, Just Vision has been making shorter films, so they have some current films, but they're not full-length documentaries, which is perhaps why they're not in the festival, illustrating dimensions of Israeli-Palestinian peace and justice activism. For example, on the Just Vision website right now is a study of the Sheikh Jarrah Solidarity Movement, which is a group of Israeli Jews and Palestinians together protesting the eviction of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem. So this is an extraordinary. The director is an American Israeli Jewish woman. They take these films to all kinds of film festivals and all kinds of educational institutions, and their purpose is not to advocate for a particular point of view, but to complexify, to confuse, to engender empathy, to engender good conversation and greater understanding. So they are by far the stars in my book of how to use film not at its worst, as we all know, because film can be used very well to emphasize reinforce stereotypes, or simply perhaps in a less obvious way to make vivid the single narrative of one side or another in a conflict. So there are many films, both on the Israeli Jewish and Palestinian side of the conflict, whose purpose it is to create passion for that particular narrative. These are the kinds of films that are really about grassroots peacemaking, which is to say, we want you to see beyond. Only our side has, the truth is entirely with our side, and the only true humans, true and full, lovable humans are the people on our side, but rather to complexify and to humanize in ways that film can do best.
Let's talk about incendiary films or incorrect films, or media being used irresponsibly, or offensively and offensively, right? When I was younger, the Mideastern situation was explained very simply to me. First, if it was so great, my grandfather said, I wouldn't have left. Right? That was pretty much the history class I got from my grandfather. Second was that it just seemed like there were just basically 2 or 3 groups that weren't getting along. There was the Arabs as generally, the Jewish community generally, and some notions of factions within the Islamic faith, the Shiites versus the Sunni. Maybe because these were the issues that were most immediate to Lebanon at that time. But now we know through the Arab Spring and the proliferation of media and social media, which maybe we'll talk a little bit about too, Daniel, with you, is that it's much more complicated than that. All right? So you have all kinds of points of view. And now the technology has made available, filmmaking being one of them to many people. So as people are venturing out looking at film, you're a peacemonger, so you're going to be someone who's going to be looking for nutritious content and not toxic content. But there's toxic content, I would assume, out there. There's toxic conversations. So I'm just going to throw it. Anyone want to say, look, there's stuff out there that you should really understand is not right. Free speech being what it is, it's, oppositional free speech, not good. Anyone that want to speak to that?
Jump in real quick. I think it's important to recognize that the films that we all have the benefit and the pleasure of seeing in this festival, your average person on the ground probably won't have access because the filmmakers lack the resources to distribute them to the masses, so to speak. And on your question of who's the next rising film star, we essentialize the Arab world, but Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, they don't really see, there is a sense of a larger pan-Arab identity, but there is a lot of distinction amongst each of these countries, based on nationalism and also based on the fact that the Middle East is a relatively new phenomenon. But where you do see this kind of thing, I would point out one Syrian American, Mustafa Akkad. Anybody know who he is? He's actually the producer of all of the Halloween movies. Syrian American filmmaker. He also created a wonderful film on Prophet Muhammad called The Message. And tragically, he was actually murdered by terrorists. His son is now living on his legacy. So I think it would be felt more globally if we did have a single Arab figure. I think the world is hungry for that. In Qatar, in Doha, they're actually funneling lots of resources to create a Hollywood in the Middle East. So there is now talk of Daniel Day-Lewis playing Rumi, which is actually America's most celebrated poet, who is a Muslim Sufi poet. And then there's actually a new film on the Prophet Muhammad, which is a multi-million-dollar thing, which will be coming out in the next 5 years, also from Doha. So a lot of that's going to be felt there, not so much in the Arab lands. In terms of Middle East-based, propaganda-based films, you have to follow the resources, you have to follow the money trail. Congressman mentioned Clarion Fund and these politicized films. Taking a step back, though, the documentary is a very authoritative source. If you put someone onto the film and they're offering commentary and they are known as an expert on a topic, the reception of that particular viewpoint is rendered authoritative. And we know, for example, the narrator of the third Jihad film, which is a very problematic film seeking to create fear and apprehension about the American Muslim community, is narrated by a gentleman named Zuhdi Jasser. And Zuhdi Jasser is someone who's actually been elected to represent the International Religious Freedom Cabinet. But his views are very outside of the mainstream American Muslim community. But your average American that might watch that particular film, and thankfully it's not on PBS, most of these films that are very propagandistic do not, thankfully, have big distribution. You have to find out how is the distribution being handled. So you got to be careful, and each film does, to a certain extent, have an agenda. If that's a subjective, artistic agenda, that may have a propaganda. There's a wonderful film about a Iranian woman who's, it's a beautiful film. She's following an emerald balloon around Iran. I don't know if anyone has seen this film, and she's simply trying to ask the question, what does it take? What is the definition of freedom for women? And she's putting that into, she's inserting a lot of gray into the picture about what freedom means for her and her relationship to her religion. So that has a certain vantage point as well. So those are just some.
All right, that I'm going to follow up, Ahmed, with you to ask, because you're the international film scholar and professor, and a snappy dresser, I might add. So the so bring the microphone a little bit closer to you. I think they're getting some feedback on you. But let's talk about traditional films and then modern films. I mean, the Arab Spring, the just generational change that is going on. I mean, we're such a didn't know much about the Middle East at all until maybe the late 70s, most of us. And so in film, what has changed, now? What is changing now that we should be watching from traditional to the modern?
The only things that seem to have changed are really the technologies of reproducing somewhat the same narratives and the same themes. If we go back to the 1920s and 30s, we've seen the shape, the Garden of Allah and things like that, where we really started a certain construction of imaginary spaces, and we also created that division between what could be symbolically created as a sacred space and as a profane space. We've seen also the exact same modes of really creating these, very unpredictable community of people who are different and very hard to understand, and to an extent irrational and so on. And those seem to be unbelievably existential to Hollywood. Hollywood could not operate without a bad Middle East, without a bad Arab, and the story and the narrative. If we look at what was post 9/11 cinema, we see pretty much the exact same images reproduced, with the exception of the theme of jihad that is in, and clearly terrorism. From the Siege, Syriana, the Traitor, Rendition, the Kingdom, they all really seem to be following the exact same storyline, with the exception of introducing fresh information, to an extent update.
So this bothers you. This is a bother, right? I mean, that there's a evilizing, if that's even a word, of the Arabs in the United States through film forever. It doesn't seem to be changing.
It doesn't. I don't want to put it on a personal level in the sense that it bothers.
Academically.
Academically, it really promotes a very, very ignorant image of a very, very difficult place to understand, similarly to the average American consumer of pop culture and of cinema in particular.
Keith, would you agree with that? Would you agree that things really haven't changed, or there's doesn't seem to be changing, even in the light of these new dialogues and information about the Mideast?
Well, I think we're all still kind of waiting to see what's going to happen next. With the new developments, all the films that the professor mentioned were sort of these post 9/11, pre-Arab Spring films. So I'm actually curious to see what now. Because to a certain extent, they were kind of like cowboy movies. The American was sort of the hero of all these Middle Eastern movies, and there was some, and quite frankly, the Arabs were kind of the Native Americans, and I mean,
right.
it kind of.
It's like Indiana Jones. I just remember him off and all the Arabs.
Right.
That was and they were these faceless victims that were kind of crazy.
To support the professor's point, there's a film out there called Real Bad Arabs, REEL, Real Bad Arabs, and so I mean it's there, but I'm hopeful about the next period, because you got, like I was gonna say, Rabbi Iber was dead on. I mean, this film crew that does Boudros and Encounter and all that, they are fabulous. And Boudros, I think, is groundbreaking. And the hero of the story is an Arab man who who sticks with nonviolence and wins, and actually attracts Hamas and Fatah people to him. And the real hero of the story is actually his daughter, who does what every father would be terrified to see his daughter do, which is to go jump in front of some bulldozers in the middle of some protest. I hope I didn't ruin the movie for you, but I would say that, you know, so far I think the professor's right, but I think that the moment that we're in should produce a new cinema regarding the Middle East.
All right, so Mazen, you're an activist. That means you're trying to, you know, change public opinion, right? And here we are in the Midwest, and here are these films which, you know, many of us, I'm sure, have heretofore maybe not known about, maybe because of a sophisticated group. How does film help you in with your activism?
Well, it's a message, right? I mean, just to follow up on what Congressman had said, there isn't a good Muslim or Arab image out there. I mean, we ask in this room here, when somebody says Muslim, what comes to mind? You know, it's not a good image. When we look on TV, and regardless of whether technology has advanced or not, and Professor Ahmad can list hundreds of movies that are bad out there, but you know, 24 or Homeland, or I mean, that's not a narrative that humanizes Arabs or Muslims out there. And so, if you look across the board, there isn't really anything out there that produces an image of Arabs or Muslims that's positive. And to Professor Ahmad's point, this element of vilifying Arabs and Muslims sells in Hollywood. And you know, you follow the money trail in a lot of ways. And so when a festival like this brings films from the Middle East that tell the story, somebody else native somebody is telling the story rather than a guy in Hollywood that's trying to make the next $1 million. And telling the story about us and for us, for the people, by the people type of thing. It raises the conscience. And I think for a lot of people that see some of the movies this weekend, hopefully they can go home and have a conversation. Boy, you know, the Homeland series is not that great, you know, or the way Jack Bauer.
It's called television.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wouldn't want to.
Most of it's not that great.
Exactly.
Right.
So speaking of television, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You know, I couldn't help but think of All American Muslim.
Exactly.
You know, here's the interesting thing about All American Muslim is that when they did show All American Arab American Muslim family in Dearborn, Michigan, you know, very close to where I grew up, the objection was these people are normal. And you know those people aren't normal. So you're propagandizing us by demonstrating these people in a humane, normal, regular, even boring light. When I thought that critique was extraordinary. We demand real, R-E-E-L, bad Arabs. I mean, that's what, I don't know, was that the message?
I mean, very, very briefly about what the American viewer has already in their memory is distorted image. And the All-American Muslim, which was canceled after the first season, does not fit that image. And therefore it's confusing to the viewer. And it was read as being propagandist. You know, the Florida Family Association, Florida has a lot of soul searching to do.
There's a euphemism.
The events that are taking place there really complain that specifically how the show does not show any extremes. The extremes are in, you know, the viewer's imagination. So the second they're not there, it becomes a problem.
So, Rabbi, what is the impediment to peace that is presented by this medium? I assume that, well, film, I'm talking about popular American media, for film, TV, I mean, we'll just take it, you know, in that direction for a bit. I mean, you're out there trying to broker peace and understanding, and the people of America, we're talking about primarily, are looking at this misinformation. Is this blowing back on your conversations? Are you feeling that as you're having community conversations?
I mean, in the Jewish community, those who are understandably driven by fear as they think about the Jewish historic experience and the Jewish narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every time they see a demonizing, yet another demonizing image of the Arabs, and I grew up, we didn't know about the Palestinians. I grew up being taught about the Arabs, all the countries, all those countries around. But all of them, they were all the same. I mean, that's part of what happens in polarized conflict. Is the other is all the same, and of course they're all out to get us. And then it's quite possible to select historic information and images that confirms that view. Just as a sidelight, not to your question. Not as a scholar of the Arab world at all, but just as a consumer of media. I remember just as the Arab Spring was beginning, it occurred to me that something game-changing here about every American. I mean, I listen to NPR and read the New York Times, but I think whatever news media you were consuming, you were watching and hearing heroic images of individual Arabs, in various. So even listening to the Arabic accent, I mean, as an American Jew growing up, I had a visceral reaction to the sound of the German language, which it took me years of a lot of intentional work to let go of, and I had a visceral reaction to the sound of the Arabic language, which more recently I've actively worked to deconstruct that completely physical, really so deeply internalized reaction, so that it takes some work to move from hearing in my own life, to shift from hearing the sound of the muezzin when I'm in Israel, and the immediate thought that arose, because this thought was reinforced in so many ways, I wonder what hateful things they said about Jews. They're saying about Jews in the mosque today, and are, is hate spewing from the imam, and is that going to spill out onto the streets? So I went through my own process of learning, of re-educating my body, much less, my mind and my heart, to hear the beauty of the sound of the muezzin. So likewise, the heroic sound of Arabic on every news. I mean, I actually don't know how it's covered on Fox, but how could it be that they're not at least some of these complexifying images of the voice of the individual heroic Arab fighting for justice and democracy? The impediment to peace is everywhere in Israel, Palestine, and everywhere, in my view, is fear and lack of trust, and the answer to that problem is to know the other. So in that sense, these humanizing films about the other side, as distinct from the films that are echo chamber films, that make the people, that elicit a certain audience to come and see a film which express a position with which they already agreed, and have it confirmed, and have them go home and talk within their echo chamber about how right that film was and how right their original view was. But rather films that confuse, that complicate, that present paradox, and so open the mind and heart to possibility.
You have a follow-up? Yeah. On the wonderful scholarship of Jack Shaheen with the Real Bad Arabs, my organization, Unity Productions Foundation, partnered with Brookings, and we asked, we did a needs assessment for 2 years in Hollywood, and we asked, what do you need as a writer, as a producer, as a director in Hollywood when it comes to portraying the Muslim experience, larger, not just Middle East? And the funny thing was that these folks, particularly writers, said, one of the secrets about writers is that they're not that worldly. They actually haven't traveled that much, and most of their consumption is through movies and television. So what they needed was access to real narratives of Muslims, like real people. They didn't know. So if you're a Muslim American, you might see a particular television show, and they would just get little things wrong, minor things, because they just didn't, And of course, if you search on Wikipedia for the answer to jihad, you gotta be careful. You know what I'm saying? So what we have done is created a resource center called Muslims on Screen and Television, mostresource.org, and we've actually held seminars where folks from Grey's Anatomy, from The Simpsons, from ER, from medical dramas, from film and television come, and they meet dynamic, charismatic, interesting Muslims from around the world. We just held one on the Arab Spring. Also, these writers and folks in Hollywood are very siloed. They don't, like inside the Beltway, have access to political, nuanced understandings of things often. And they're under pressure. They're under pressure to create storylines. So if you take 24, Howard Gordon, he also did Homeland. Homeland, it's a terrorism narrative. Of course, at face value, it's going to have problems. But if you look at it closely, there are gradual improvements of the portrayal of Muslims. So it's not all bad news, I guess, is the only thing I wanted to say.
This is a pretty good one. Keith, so someone asks, I think in connection with some of the filmmakers that you were talking about that edify on the conditions and less prejudiced positions in the condition in the Mideast, are these films available to your colleagues? And is there a way to make these films available to your colleagues so they could have maybe a different perspective on policy making?
You know, we do screenings on Capitol Hill on a regular basis. We screen Boudreaux. We actually had the producer and the director talk about it, and we had Ayad Morar, who was sort of the star of the show. So we try to get movies in front of the Congress as often as we can. Truth be told, you know, there's always 10 things going on, and so if we can get 10 members to come watch a movie, we feel like we've done really well. But we will get staff, and staff, you know, finish, you know, chip and dip, and they'll come, man. And so we feed them and show them a movie. You know, this is like a cheap date. So the staff does inform the members what's really going on. So there are good ways. I tell you this, they also show what I would call the ugly ones too. You know, Third Jihad, Fitna, and Obsession all played on Capitol Hill by people who want to push that line of thinking, like Senator Kyle of Arizona, Sue Myrick of North Carolina. They're the ones pushing this stuff. And you know, I don't know why I want to say this, but I feel it's important to point out that, you know, the Jewish members of Congress are not the ones pushing this ugly anti-Muslim stuff by and large. You know, almost never. It's really, this is a candid, straight up, honest panel,
Truth
right?
works, usually works.
Yeah, it's really these people who have a vision of the Middle East that, you know, the end of times is going to emanate from there.
It doesn't include Jews or Muslims.
Right. And so these folks who have this idea that Jesus is coming back when the Jews get to Israel, they're really straight. They're the ones who want to film all this stuff, you know, so and screen it. So I just throw that out there because I think it's important. I don't know why. It's a fact that
I think it's your job,
yeah.
you know, to report that stuff back to your state. So, all right. Not that you're a woman, and you're obviously not, but here's a question about women in filmmaking. And one person asked that they see more films filmed by women coming out of the Mideast than from Hollywood. You think that's true, statistically true, or, and what even the impression, is that true?
I will respond to that question from the perspective of commentary. So I'm not really an expert on Arab women. I think Arab women could represent themselves if they were going to talk about filmmaking and so on. It's a dangerous position for me, an Arab male, to be speaking on behalf of the Arab woman.
You want to pass?
Is you know, capable of talking for herself. So just my.
Is there a Muslim woman? Is there a woman in the house?
Pretty sure there are. The comment that I would make is really more about, yes, seeing the presence of Arab women contributing to clearly changing some of the way films are being made. And also, it's very different to see reality portrayed from someone else's perspective. namely that, it's not in any way connected to patriarchy, which still exists and still as healthy as it is everywhere else in the West. If you heard about the Augusta golf club issue, the patriarchy is everywhere. The contribution of Arab women filmmakers, to an extent, really makes us look at cultural issues, namely Arab cultural issues, from a very strong perspective, in the sense that really we're looking at an area where self-criticism is very powerful. And so we're not really looking at documentary or filmmaking only in terms of the entertaining side, but also many women contributed in the sense that educated, dealt with certain issues that normally they're not really discussed in the public sphere, just because of the powers that create a certain hierarchy in terms of what are the interesting topics and so on and so forth. And so in that sense, yes, of course, they have a very valid contribution to the kind of cultural debate that we see take place in the Arab sphere.
What organizations might be available to allow support of some of the positions and films that you're talking about, whether it's Just Vision or movements like that, or Rabbi, the movements you're involved in? This is a time to say, look, I really think that if you want to be proactive about film, art, and community involvement, this is what I would recommend.
Just Vision has no peer in connection with these
How do you
organizations.
plug in to support it? What can someone do to support,
I think the website is justvision.org. I mean, only to strengthen the question, it's important in peacemaking circles for people to remind themselves and others regularly how much money flows into the extremist side. How would things change? Just imagine if people trying to bring people together, if people working on the humanizing agenda, on empathy building, had a small fraction of the amount of money, be it the grassroots peacemakers, be it artists, musicians, filmmakers, whatever it is. You think about the financial imbalance, and it's really staggering. It would quite literally be a different world if money streamed into the forces of moderation. So that's really the only thing I have to say. In terms of filmmakers, they're really the best there is. It's the best there is.
Sure, we've got a local organization here called MISNA. It's an Arab American literary organization. It publishes the only Arab American literary journal in the U.S. It also produces a film festival out of Northeast. It's the largest Arab film festival.
Right here.
Right here in Minneapolis.
Serious?
Bigger than San Francisco, and I think the one in New York includes all the Middle East.
Is MISNA published?
Published in Minneapolis.
Really?
Yep, published in Minneapolis. We get writers from all over the U.S., and it's all volunteer organization. And it really goes back to the initial point that we were talking about, is to tell our story,
Right.
not have somebody represent. That's it, yeah.
So I need to jump in then. I wasn't thinking local. In response to your question, I'm looking at David Harris. There's a very wonderful Jewish-based arts organization locally called Rimon, R-I-M-O-N, that uses the arts, not only film, but the arts, art, music, dance, as a vehicle for dialogue and cross-cultural interreligious education. They're a marvelous organization. So I'm sure they accept donations, and certainly their program offerings are very much worth following.
Thank you so much for coming this morning.